Hello, boys and girls. Today I want to talk about making records, producing music, what it used to be and what it is now. Because a lot of things have changed over the years and over the decades. Other things have stayed the same. All the gear is digital now. Do we still need the analog gear these days? Do we still need bigger studios these days? What is a home recording studio? Will all records be produced in home recording environments on laptops in the future? Where is this all going? And I'm not alone on this channel today. I'm talking to someone who has been and still is in this crazy world of music production for a very long time and who has seen it all and heard it all. I'm pretty sure he's going to enlighten us today. So please say hello to my dear friend and colleague, Warren Huart. How are you?
I'm good. How the devil are you, Kristian? You're doing marvellously well. Wie geht es dir?
Yeah, I'm doing great. First beer is open and I'm always excited.
I can't believe that's your first beer. There's no way.
It says 2.8, so it's even a light beer.
I think that's called a session beer, isn't it? It doesn't get you drunk. It just you
Right.
pee it out faster than you can drink it.
Kind of, yeah. And you know what? This is actually the first time that I interview you. Usually it's the other way around, right?
Yeah, that's me being a happy dancer.
I got a great first question for
All
you.
right, hit me with the first question.
I just said that you have been doing this for a while, and when you started, when was the first time you actually got paid for either recording or mixing somebody else's music?
That's a really good question.
I told you.
The first proper session was with my now very, very good friend, Louise Goffin. And I was working at a music store selling recording equipment and PA equipment. I think I was 19. I was a guitar player playing in bands. That was my main. I was playing in bands and I was working in a music store. I think a lot of people do that, don't they? They want to make money, but they don't want to get a quote-unquote proper job, so they work in music stores. So I was working in this music store, and I remember getting a phone call on a Friday from this band that had a studio. Two sets of brothers had the studio, which I sort of, not necessarily interned at, but just kind of worked at part-time. And they said to me, oh, we're playing some shows this weekend, and we just got a phone call from Guy Chambers, huge songwriter. And he said his friend Louise wanted to come in and record that weekend, and was their studio available? And they were like, yes. They just said yes, and then they had to figure out who was going to be, the assistant/engineer on the session. And I don't remember whether they offered me money or not. I think I did get paid. But the point is like it was such an amazing opportunity because Louise turns up, her bass player's Gerland Dorsey.
Wow.
Gerland Dorsey subsequently went on to play bass for David Bowie for about 20 years. The guitar player and the drummer, I was talking to Louise about this the other day, I believe were the Stacey brothers. And the Stacey brothers are Britain's biggest session players. And even in those days, they were really well known and were playing with everybody. And the producer was Andy Jackson, who also happens to be Dave Gilmour's right-hand guy and produced Pink Floyd. So there I am. I'm a teenager, 19 years old, and in walks probably some of the biggest people in the business. And that's my first baptism of fire, working a proper session there. And
well, that's a pretty good gig for a newcomer.
For a newcomer,
not bad.
But it reminds me of what Al Schmidt told me. Al told me that he had been assisting and just plugging in cables. I don't remember which studio. Let's say Capitol. I don't know if it was Capitol or not, but at a studio. And he has a session he's booked on to assist. And the engineer just didn't show up. I can't remember what the reason was, but it was a legitimate reason. Didn't show up. And he said, the artist turned to him and said, I suppose you're it then, you're the engineer. And he said he was super nervous. So I said to Al, I was like, who was the artist? He goes, Duke Ellington.
Wow.
Certainly wasn't Duke Ellington. That was it. That was my baptism of fire. So that's the first session that could have been paid and probably was, but I don't remember. I think I like that answer when I'm thinking about it because I think quite often, of course we want to get paid, but the experience of learning is so much more powerful. And I learned so much about recording drums. Andy came in and he brought in his own pair of U87s. And he set the 87s above the drum kit. He put a D12 on the kick drum and a 57 on the snare. And that was the drum sound, 4 mics. And it sounded phenomenal.
And what was your first professional setup? Your own setup? Was that ADATs or?
Yeah, I think when I moved to, I started working in that studio, so I did quite a few sessions there. Not a lot, but a handful of sessions, because that was all about the time that my band started to become, semi-successful, never huge, but, we started playing a lot of shows. We played in Reading Rock Festival. We played Roskilde. We did lots of different stuff. But then we came to America in 95, the end of 95. And we did an album with Don Smith, and that was on 2-inch tape and a little Neve console. And the apartment I got in Silver Lake in early 96, I bought a Soundtrax Topaz, which was a 24-channel console. It was only about this big, but it was 24 channels.
I remember that one.
It was a great console. Wish I still had it. One of those things in those days where they just kind of compacted, you got all this EQ and you can this many auxiliaries and you can return here and send there and do this and group this. It was all a million different functions on a small format console. And I got one ADAT initially, and then I bought a second one. So I had 16 tracks of ADAT. I had one blackface and one of the grayer ones, and sync them together, so I had 16 tracks. And then I started recording bands. I did a jazz ska band. It was like a ska band but they had a stand-up bass player, so it was a little bit more kind of jazzy. And then my own band I recorded there. So anyway, I was getting paid, and this is all in my apartment. So in an apartment, I was having drums set up in the front room, in the corridor between the bedrooms. I would have somebody playing bass, and then I'd put the guitar amp in the bathroom. And
I did the same thing. I did exactly the same thing. So what I think is interesting that the end of the 90s, it was already possible, without breaking the bank, to get some gear to make good sounding records, because I also started with 1 and then 2 ADATs. I had a Tascam 24 channel console, kind of like the same thing. I got the money by recording local bands, and but it was already possible. Of course, compared to today, where you can do music on a laptop with pretty much no budget at all, this is still a lot of money. But it was already a time where it was possible to get a studio, a good sounding studio. That was a home recording studio.
It was a home recording studio, and then my next opportunity I just did music all the time. It was either recording a band or playing in a band or a combination of. And we went into this one rehearsal room, and I got talking to whoever ran the studio at that time, and they said, I told them I had a home studio, and they had this little tiny control room, miniature control room, that was connected to the biggest room they had. And they said to me, why don't you move all of your home stuff into that control room? And there's a bigger room and you can record from there. So that's what I did. And I think they had one ADAT and I had 2. So suddenly now it's 24 tracks of ADAT.
Woo! I remember how long it took to get 3 ADATs in sync. You were rewinding. Then the first one started playing so you could hear the drums. Then after 3 seconds you could hear the guitars. And then then the other one was still rewinding and trying to get back into... it was... Yeah, ADATs.
But with the ADATs, I know what you mean. But I think I just got used to it and it never really bothered me.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
It never bothered me.
It worked. It worked.
And the quality was phenomenal. I mean,
Yeah.
There's some amazing albums that came out at that time that were done on ADATs. Really unbelievably good. But anyway, to cut a very long story short, back in England, I had produced bands and engineered bands and got record deals. And when I'd come to America, I'd realized the business was very different. Mm-hmm. My band in England, we had done the demos. They'd been done at that studio by a guy called Nick Hannon, who was the main engineer at the studio where I'd been working. And when we got signed, they made us retrack the lead single to put out. And the label boss, Jeremy Lascelles, for anybody that knows Jeremy, didn't like the producer, the production that had been done that he had spent money on. He's like, I don't like it as much as your demo. And we sat there and we listened to the demo and we listened to the expensive recording. And he's like, the demo's better, just remix it. And what we ended up doing was like recalling it, almost doing nothing to it, but just printing it louder. We just got a louder, punchier mix, just a bit more compression on the master bus, just made it hit a little harder. Went back into his office and played it. He played it, A-B'd it between our original mix and the new production, expensive production. And he's like, this is it, put it out. And it was a hit. It wasn't like a massive hit, but it did well. It did well for us. And, that was my experience. My experience was the best thing won in the UK. When I moved to America, it wasn't about what was best. It was about $1 million recording. And often that stuff that would come out, you'd listen to it, be flat and very sterile and lack that enthusiasm and energy that you put in when you were working with a band, creating everything. It was just like the sterile version of it. And of course, most of the time it didn't connect. I think that we're in a wonderful time now for making music because the budgets, especially for rock bands, as you know, aren't big. So if you, meaning anybody watching this, does discover a band, produce it, develop it, co-write the songs, perform on it, and you make it sound great, it's quite likely when it gets signed, maybe they'll remix it, maybe they won't, but it's quite likely now they'll just put it out. They would just put it out. They can't give it to, Fred Famous, the producer, with Fred Famous, the engineer, and Fred Famous, the mixer, and spend $1 million doing it anymore because they'll never recoup that expense.
That's the next question. Like comparing the 90s to today, like if people are in a similar situation like you were, or like I was, with a let's call it home recording setup. So some things have stayed the same, right? You still need the energy. Yep. You still don't want sterile productions. The gear has changed. Some of it has changed. Some of it hasn't. The question is, do we still need Fred, the famous producer? Do we still need big studios, or are they going to disappear? Or what do you think? What's going to happen and what's important?
No, great question. I think there's a different answer for every single one of those because the reality is it depends on the project, doesn't it? If you're working with, I know you've done this, you've worked with bands where the bands are 17, 18, and then you work with guys that are like 40 to 65 years old. When you're working with the older musicians that are used to tracking in a room, you need a room. That's part of their experience.
I feel like home recording is gonna replace a lot of what used to be like traditional studio business.
Right.
And if I'm starting out now, like how do I get into this? Because it used to be like you interning at that bigger studio and then you getting a job here and getting a job where. That has changed, right?
Well, I didn't really intern. I mean, that's the reality. Is like. And I think that's been one of the blessings. I've just kind of had a baptism of fire because I was already a guy that had done demos and recorded bands and everything in a home environment. And they're like, come and do that at our studio. I didn't have that formal, like, runner, assistant, proper training, work on big records. I mean, I literally they just went, here's the studio, you've done demos, so you know how it all works, don't you? Like, oh, yeah, sure. I had no idea. And there wasn't any internet. They had an MSR 24. They had a 1-inch 24-track tape machine. And I just, saw photos and like, how do I make it fit and all this kind of stuff. It was just really, it was pretty embarrassing. And during that session with Louise, I think I rewound a couple of times too far. And I was putting the tape back on.
I think today there's so much information out there compared to back in the days. Mm-hmm. I always tell that story of, me sitting here in my little German village trying to figure out how things work with all the pros and cons, that has changed so much, right? It's like back in the days you were just trying a lot of stuff, and these days it's just about finding the right places to get informed or not getting the wrong information. Or how do you learn how to do this these days?
It is really difficult. I mean, we're in a space between the two of us, and this has become comical because both you and I have businesses that we built around helping people and giving them the right information, and it's super, super important to both you and I, and that's where we resonate together about giving real information. And I've never liked experts, as you know. All of my friends in the music industry, like the Jack Douglases and the Shelley, the guys that made these records that we all consider to be the greatest records, none of them think they're experts. They're all very much about just all about the creativity first. And
Yeah.
great music is made by people pushing down barriers, trying different ideas and blending different genres together. And I love that sense of creativity. And I think that trumps any kind of expertness. However, of course, we're here to help people with the basics and keep them on track. And one of the things that was really important to me, because I wrote a book. I wrote a book called Home Studio Recording.
That's a thick book. That's thick. How long?
453 pages, took 3 years to write.
Oh my God.
It is a combination of everything I've learned and also every single incredible producer, engineer, and mixer, and mastering engineer that I've interviewed. So there's a lot. There's just not just there's tons of information. There's a lot of research gone into this. And it's everything. Studio setup, pre-production, producing, recording, mixing, and mastering.
Wait, now you surprised me. So that's like a real book? People can buy the hardware? Or is it?
Actual, proper. There's a paperback, there's a hard book version, there's a Kindle version, and there will eventually be a downloadable version, yes.
Wow.
Like all mic placements, everything. I'm sure you can show PDFs of much higher quality.
Send me some
XYs,
stuff.
Everything, Bloomline.
And so this is about, tell me more. It's about like miking, recording,
It's
acoustic
everything.
instruments.
It's basically...
Mixed,
Yeah, it's everything. It's everything from acoustic guitar to full orchestras to metal guitars to drums. With 1 mic, 2 mics, 3 mics, 4 mics, 40 mics, to producing it. Actually talking to artists, getting performances, mixing it. All the recording process, the pre-production process. Setting up your own studio, choosing what gear to buy, knowing when to buy something new, maybe buying something used, bang for the buck. For instance, I talk about, like you and I were talking about the Topaz. I'll make a point of I love Neve style mic pre's. However, if you're starting your first studio, you could buy one really expensive, like a BAE mic pre. Absolutely love it. It's one of the best mic pre's ever made. Their version of the Neve 1073 is mwah. But it's like $3,500, $4,000. If you happen to have a garage and you want to record local rock bands, take that $3,500, $4,000 and go out and buy a used AMEC console, a Soundcraft, a Soundtrax from the 80s or 90s that has 24 really good sounding mic pre's in it and record drums through it. Or you could buy one $4,000 mic pre and record the vocal.
What would be your recommended home studio setup right now? Of course, it depends on what you need to record, but
it depends on what. Yeah, it goes back to your question about traditional studios versus thing.
But it's
what
still
do you want to do?
Would you prefer something like a very small portable laptop setup with, I just checked out the Audient preamp, so that way, for example, you can get a really small rig? Or would you recommend, because you talked about getting a used AMEC console or something, which is, so where would you go? Would you go more digital to be more portable and to be smaller? Or would you go for vintage analog gear because it's cheap now?
If I was doing what I do now as a rock pop guy, I would probably get a laptop. I'd probably buy the Evo 16. We're talking about bang for the buck, best value for money. I'd buy the Evo 16. So I get 8 inputs, but then I would probably expand it with the SPF 8 because we're only talking $1,000 and I got 16 inputs now. Then I would buy, or I would, at the same time, I would probably just use their mic pre's. Or if I could only afford one 16 input, one 8 input one, I would buy a used, maybe a Topaz, maybe a Soundcraft, Soundtrax, Allen & Heath console from the 80s or 90s, and I would just submix if I only had 8 inputs and then expand it from there. Because that's the thing, it's you want to record a band live, you could do it with 8 inputs, you just got to be clever. You've got to be or you've got to be all the keys. Maybe you're recording a band with a keyboard player with loads of keyboards, just sum them down to a stereo track. Bass might be DI and amp, sum it down to one track but EQ it inside of the console. Consoles still have value if you're recording live musicians. If you're not recording live musicians and you're building tracks, inside of the box using virtual instruments, then you really just need a 2 input. Yeah. So that's why it's really about what music are you doing. If you're doing modern pop, you can probably get away with a 1 or 2 input interface, probably just a 1. and the mic pre's that come with these things now are ridiculously good. And then it's really just a case of like a nice mic, a good sounding mic with a 1 or 2 input interface, and then spending some money on some decent plugins.
Right.
And most of the plugins, the stock plugins that will come with your DAW will do a good job, but there might be 2 or 3 cherry picked. Okay, I personally can't mix a record without MV2 on my bass. I love what that does with the low information. It's $29.
Yeah.
The R bass or an equivalent by another manufacturer, $29.
Sure, there's a lot of great stuff out there. I think I would do the same thing, like laptop and then a high input, whatever, portable solution like the Evo 16 or something else. And then I think these days I would get a API 500 rack.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm able to buy stuff, constantly buy stuff in case I need it and to add color, or maybe I want to buy a more high-end preamp at some point, or I just need some kind of coloration box or a compressor or something like that. But for me, it has always been more important what's like the source, the instrument or the guitar amp or the guitar cab, and then comes the mic, and everything that comes after that gets less and less and less important. So yeah, there are differences between different converters, but if you pick the wrong guitar speaker, no converter in the world's gonna fix that. And like you said, all the consumer gear has become incredibly good. So there's no excuse. Excuse for not making great sounding records with any of those. Those consumer interfaces these days, I guess.
I use this example all the time. So basically, this is the famous AKG D19. Mm-hmm. And so this is the microphone that Jeff Emmerich used a lot with the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And it is essentially an inexpensive Austrian-made 57. Obviously, the 57 came afterwards, but I just use that as an example because everybody knows what a 57 is. This is a really good, inexpensive, dynamic microphone that now, if they're in great condition like this, goes for an absolute massive fortune because they were used by the Beatles. When I asked Jeff, why did you use the D19? He responded, because it was plugged in.
Yeah.
My point with the D19 is and everybody likes to, because it's on the Beatles records, which are, some of the biggest selling records and best selling records of all time, everybody wants to pretend that this is more magical than it is. It is a wonderful microphone. I'm very blessed to have it. Thank you very much. But ultimately, it's just saying at the time it was an inexpensive microphone and it was used on all these great records. So a 57 or somebody's version of a 57, any company that you and I know that makes an inexpensive dynamic microphone could make an amazing record. So if you only have a 57 or Lewitt's inexpensive one or whoever, and just name a company, AKG, entry models, Audio-Technica, Biodynamic, any of these companies will do like $100 dynamic microphone. You've got that, you've got your interface, you're ready to go. And like I say, I like you said, I agree with you. At stage 2 for me would be the 500 series rack. But stage 1 is not the 500 series, but stage 2, then you can start choosing flavors of mic pre's, compressors and EQs and
that's the difference for me, because if you do a session, if you work creatively with musicians, you just have to be fast. Yeah. There's no time to check out different mic pre's and stuff. But you got to do your homework. So I love comparing different mic pre's. Sure. So whenever I'm in the fire of a production, I know that probably the API is going to be right, or probably, but I just have one take because I don't want to disturb the singer, the drummer, whoever. So that's the combination. I think that's the best combination. If you know your gear, and pick the right stuff at the right time, and know that the creativity and that the magic of the moment and the energy is way more important than the gear, right?
Yep, creativity first. But don't get me wrong, we explore it all. I mean, we talk about large format consoles, we talk about expensive microphones, we do it. All of that stuff comes into play. But we do it, and we're interviewing and talking to everybody that we've had on the channel. So there's a bit of everything in there, but it's presenting it in a balanced way. And we're also, bang for the buck comes up quite a lot of the time. It's like, what can you do that's maybe inexpensive enough, but gives you the feeling when somebody walks into the studio, you've got that. I mean, I often feel like the 87, the reason why it's such a perfect microphone, I think it's an overpriced microphone. I think it sells for like $3,000 or $4,000 over in the US. It's a lot of money, but when you buy a Neumann U87, if it's your only high quality microphone, and I don't suggest any beginner buys a U87.
No, please.
But if you've got it, no. But it's an understanding of why is a U87 a great microphone. It's great because it was used on so many great records. I asked Hugh Padgham and Steve Lillywhite what, if they only had one microphone, what would it be? They all say U87, and they've made some of the best-selling records ever. It's the most utilitarian. It will do any job. You put it on a kick drum, a vocal, a piano, a guitar, whatever, acoustic, electric. The other thing is it's bulletproof. And
I gotta say, it looks great. It kind of defined the look of large diaphragm condensers also in a way, which is also important. I gotta say that.
Yeah.
I'm still blown away that you have been silently writing a book for...
Writing it for 3 years?
3 years even. I thought 2 years.
3 years, yeah. Well, you know me. I'm never busy enough, am I? You know, I'm never doing anything.
You haven't been talking about this, right? It was really like a secret project. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
I'm going to check it out. So everybody, if you want to learn something about the entire world of making records, right?
The entire world of making records. Yeah.
There's a book now in digital and analog form, whatever you prefer. Yeah, I'm impressed. We have talked for a while. I don't know how long this was, but it was great. And I got to say thank you. Everybody, check out the links below to all the different versions, I guess, of the book. And
yes,
thank you very much for doing this. And I'm looking forward to checking it out myself.
You rock. Thanks, Kristian, for having me on the channel. This is good.
It's great.
I like being interviewed by you. Then when I'm talking too much, as I usually do, it doesn't feel quite so unusual. Oh, wait there, I'm the one that's supposed to be doing the talking. Okay.
No, that was fine. I was having fun with my beer and listening to you. It was great. Thanks again. So, everybody, I see you in hell, motherfuckers. Bye-bye.